Dear Professor John Lewis Gaddis and dear participants, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. First of all, wish you all a happy new year 2021 and welcome you all to a nice webinar on future of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Indo-Pacific Affairs is one of the major research centers of NICE. The Indo-Pacific region has emerged as a major center of geostrategic interest. As a political and strategic concept, it has gradually established into the foreign policy legion of some countries, especially the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. This research topic focuses on Southeast Asia, the South Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. To speak on this very important topic of today, we have invited Professor John Lewis Gaddis. Professor Gaddis, we'd like to welcome you to our webinar. Professor Gaddis needs no introduction, but still, as per the tradition, let me briefly introduce you all to Professor Gaddis. Professor John Lewis Gaddis is a Robert Lovett Professor of Military and Naval History of Yale University, where he teaches a course on the Cold War, grand strategy, biography, and historical methods. His most recent book include The Landscape of History, How Historians Map the Past, published in 2002, Surprise, Security, and the American Experience, 2004, The Cold War, A New History, in 2005, a new edition of Strategies of Containment, a critical appraisal of post-war American national security policy, in 2005, George F. Kennan, An American Life, 2011, and On Grand Strategy in 2018. Professor Gaddis have received 2 awards of undergraduate teaching at Yale, as well as National Humanities Medal and the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for biography. Professor Gaddis, it is our privilege to have you with us. We are really honored for your kind presence. I, on behalf of NICE, would like to, as well as all our participants, would like to thank you for your valuable time. We will have around 30 to 40 minutes to make your presentation, and then we'll open the floor for discussions. We'd like to request all our participants to drop their questions in the Zoom chat box or under Facebook Live. Professor Gaddis, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Director, and thanks to all who've come on this first business day of the new year. It's my first trip to Kathmandu, and it was a surprisingly easy trip, I must say. I got there very quickly this morning. So that makes it all the more exciting. Our topic is the future of Indo-Pacific strategy, and obviously you cannot talk about the future without talking about the past. So the topic presumes some interest in history, some interest in the past. We have no other database to draw on apart from that, it seems to me. So obviously that's what I will be talking about this morning. I would like to do it in terms of a reasonably brief presentation, which I will try to make at the same time somewhat provocative. And I would like to leave as much time as possible for questions, because I understand we have a lot of them out there, and questions are more fun anyway than lectures are, it seems to me, most of the time. So let me just start with a few comments about the past of grand strategy studies, not just with regard to the Indo-Pacific, but more broadly as well. One of the things that historians and policymakers have been debating pretty avidly over the last 3 or 4 years is the so-called Thucydides trap. This is an idea introduced by Professor Graham Allison at Harvard, drawing on Thucydides' great history of the Peloponnesian War, that in 3 out of 4 historical cases in which there has been a rising great power, the existing great power, out of fear of that rise, went to war with that rising power. And obviously what's implied here is the emergence of China as a rising superpower. I think we can safely call it a superpower now, a condition that really did not exist a quarter of a century ago, and certainly not half a century ago. So this is a big change in the geopolitical order. And the question is, does the Thucydides trap, the Thucydides pattern, apply to this situation? This question has engaged the attention of policymakers in Washington, although not recently, because the chief policymaker in Washington does not read much history, if any, but he's got only 3 more weeks to go. But certainly it has engaged the interest of policymakers in China and elsewhere in the world. And I think it makes a good starting point for this discussion. The danger of trying to draw patterns from history is that there are too many patterns. There is too much history. There are imperfect, contradictory analytical tools for dealing with the past. So do you do case studies, for example, as political scientists do, and as Graham Allison's colleagues have done, so that you look at 12 or 14 or 15 major cases and then draw conclusions? Do you do more cases than that, in which case your level of detail can be much smaller for each one of these? Do you simply rely on more impressionistic judgments and stay away from case studies altogether? All of these approaches have been used in dealing with and assessing the Thucydides trap question, and they have produced varying results. Political scientists tend to say, well, 3 out of 4 cases, that's pretty impressive. Historians tend to be much more skeptical for the reasons that I've mentioned. Close readers of Thucydides, close readers of his history of the Peloponnesian War, would say, oh, the whole thing is much too simple because Thucydides gives us an immensely complex account from which it's hard to draw specific lessons beyond Thucydides' general warning that the future will in some way reflect the past, but it will not duplicate the past. Human nature, Thucydides says, is much the same across time and space and culture, but this doesn't give us very much to go on. That's a very broad generalization indeed. I think more valuable is the approach of looking at the century that has just passed, the 20th century, looking at great power encounters in these years, looking at which ones saw a rising power provoke fear among established powers, which led to great wars. And certainly 1914 is a classic example of this, a war nobody wanted, but nonetheless a war that happened as a result of the rising power of Germany and the prospect that Germany, if it gained domination of Europe and the Eurasian continent, could develop not only the largest land army, but also a navy capable of rivaling that of Great Britain, which had used its navy to maintain offshore balancing powers since the age of Elizabeth I even. So that set up a rivalry that was subject to inflammation from small ignitions. And one of those small ignitions in 1914 set off the Great War. The Second World War was totally different, it seems to me. This was not a war that anyone blundered into. It was a war deliberately provoked by Hitler. It was a war deliberately fought by the Allies once they decided to fight and not to appease. It was, I think everyone would conclude, not a blunder, but a necessary war. And sometimes wars are indeed necessary. And that one qualifies as well. But it seems to me that there are 2 other wars that did not happen in the 20th century that are worth thinking about. One of them obviously is the Cold War, which I've spent a good deal of my scholarly career writing about and have tried to make the argument, why was it that this confrontation between the Soviet Union and its allies and the United States and its allies did not produce a great war, despite its intensity, despite its global character, despite indeed its duration. It went for 45 years, which is a very long period, indeed so long that I started calling it a long peace and wrote a book with that title. That one has been frequently talked about. But another war that did not happen as a result of the rise of a new great power was the Anglo-American War of the beginning of the 20th century. And you've never heard of that war because it never happened. But if you think about what the United States was doing in the 19th century, it was a rising power. It was increasing its domination over the North American continent, which it had done by mid-century. The Union's victory in the American Civil War ensured that a modern military industrial complex would emerge from this. Lincoln's own thinking during the Civil War looked forward to the future in which the United States would have the power not just to repel Europeans from the Western Hemisphere, but to redress balances of power in Europe itself when that became necessary. So it's as if Lincoln foresaw the role that the Americans played when they finally entered World War I in 1917 and the role that they played again in 1941 in entering World War II. But by the logic of the Thucydides trap, the British should have gone to war with the Americans to prevent that. And of course, the last time the British did go to war with the Americans was in a very different context, 1812, when both nations were under very, very different circumstances. Why did the Great War not happen between the Americans and the British at the beginning of the 20th century? And I think in this case, it's because the British decided on a policy of appeasement. Lord Salisbury, as Foreign Secretary and as Prime Minister, simply decided that Britain was in no condition to resist the rise of American power, partly because Britain had only credible naval capabilities, and the United States is capable of dominating the continent of North America. More precisely because the United States had a great hostage next door called Canada, which the British did not wish to lose. And so the British simply made it their policy to erase all areas of conflict between the United States and Great Britain in the 1890s and in the early 1900s, thus paving the way for the Americans to come to the conclusion, as they did in 1917, that the defense of Great Britain and France was indeed critical to American national security, and this tipped the balance. That's another way that a rising power can be accommodated, is through appeasement. And I think it raises a question for us as to whether, with regard to the current situation and the current rising power that we are thinking about, all of us, China, the best policies are resistance or appeasement, or maybe the third policy of containment, which is generally thought of as having been the American policy with regard to the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Now, let me say just a word about containment and what it involved, because containment is a contested topic. It was at the time, and it has been since, by historians. It is most associated, of course, with George Kennan, the American diplomat and grand strategist, whose biography I did indeed write. But it was not always implemented in a manner consistent with Kennan's convictions. And so Kennan himself emerged as a persistent critic of American foreign policy during the Cold War. But basically the idea was that the United States did not have to dominate the world in the post-World War II period, and indeed could not and should not try to dominate the world. That the United States should not resist, could not retreat into isolationism again, as it had done at previous points in its history, because the nature of power had changed. Oceans no longer provided security in the way that they had in the past. And so there would have to be involvement. But a third way, which I think was the strategy that containment was based on ensuring, was to reconstruct a balance of power in the world. Excuse me. To say that if indeed we could have a post-World War II world with 5 great powers, or 4 great powers, or 6 great powers, each countering each other, but at the same time stabilizing each other. This could be an international order that could last for a long time, that could preserve peace, that could in time regain and ensure and spread prosperity. And it implied that the United States did not have to remake the world. It implied that the United States did not even have to become the most powerful nation in the world, even though it certainly was at the end of World War II. But Kennan said that as long as the American power center was secure, as long as Britain and the British Empire were secure, as long as Japan was secure, we could tolerate a Russia which dominated the Soviet Union, part of Europe, and we could live with that prospect. Each of these units counterbalancing the other, and this was the idea. It was a pentagonal arrangement, later adapted in a different form by Nixon and Kissinger, who added China to this mix. And so I think the question that faces us today with regard to China is which one of these models is really feasible for the Indo-Pacific region, for the United States, which one is feasible for China itself? Because a stable international system does have to meet the needs of each of the participants. And if it does not do that, then it's going to be an unstable system. So it seems to me this is where we are at this point. Can this be done? Can some kind of balance of power, multinational in character, multilateral in manner, be constructed? Do we have this now? Can it be reinforced? What is threatening? That's the question that I want to wind up with in what I say today. And I'll be very interested in your questions and comments on this as well. So what kind of world order does China actually want? And this is a question, of course, that you would ultimately have to ask the Chinese leadership to explain. But they've been pretty clear in their explanations, particularly in the last 6 or 8 years. Xi Jinping has redefined China's aspirations in the world to make it clear that China will not be simply a nation that hides its power and seeks to conceal its strength, as Deng Xiaoping recommended, but it will be a power that makes it clear that it is a great power in the world. It will be a power that is demanding respect from other nations in the world. And some have seen echoes in Xi Jinping, going back to the concept of the old Chinese emperors and the idea of one great power under the heavens. There cannot be two under the heavens, according to the Chinese saying, demanding not just respect, but tribute from smaller powers within its sphere. That question is unresolved at the moment, but this is certainly one that is being avidly debated. And it remains to be seen exactly where China will go in this regard. The question then would be, where can the rest of the world go in response to this? Where can the United States go? To what extent would the security of other nations be impaired by this? And that is a question, it seems to me, that is at the center of our attention, or should be at the center of our attention right now. One of the things to keep in mind, and here I'm going to speak only as an American, I would not purport to speak for anyone else, but as an American, we have a habit sometimes of not asking honest questions of ourselves. What kind of world do we really want? We have a tendency to get our self-righteousness confused with our self-interest. And the question that I would have is, how would we feel about a China that proclaims itself to be #1 in the world? Can we the Americans, be the second sun under the heaven in this regard? Can there be a dual hegemonic system? Can there be some more hegemons than this? What is our attitude toward this? It really resolves around the question, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to protect your own interests in the world? How far do those interests extend? Are you trying to change the world? Are you trying to reform the world? And so on. The American answer to this realistically and historically has always been, no, we are not trying to change the world. What we want is a world in which we can prosper. But this does not depend on transforming the rest of the world into us. That was at least the great historic tradition of American diplomacy, going all the way back to John Quincy Adams in a famous address that he made in 1821 saying, we are models for the rest of the world, but we do not go around imposing our views on the rest of the world. The alternative to this was the Wilsonian model of saying we have to transform the world into liberal democracies. And that was a strong current in the 20th century as well. So where we are now, it seems to me, is a considerable issue, will be a considerable issue for the new Biden administration that will be taking power. I feel pretty sure that it will not regard it as having been or being now an American interest to transform the rest of the world into democracies. It seems to me a push was made for democracy promotion in the post-Cold War period. In the Clinton administration, certainly with the decision to expand NATO in the Bush, George W. Bush administration, with its efforts to spread democracy in the Middle East, and to a lesser extent in the Obama administration. It seems to me that strategy has very visibly failed. And in fact, there are fewer democracies now, even in Europe. If you look at the standards of the number of democracies in the world, it's down discernibly from what it would have been 10, 15 years ago. Whether that is due to American overbearing arrogance or whether it's due to a new set of circumstances that the Americans simply were not prepared for, or whether it has nothing to do with the Americans at all. These are questions historians will have to resolve. But the tide of democracy, the so-called inevitability of democracy, the so-called Fukuyama thesis that with the Cold War over, there is no other alternative but democracy, is thoroughly discredited at that point. And I think that's a world that the Biden administration is going to have to live with. Similarly, something like that has happened with market capitalism, because market capitalism, which was thought to have triumphed with the end of the Cold War, again, has undergone a good number of bumps and crashes, most notably the financial crisis of 2008. And it has still not completely recovered from this. So the Chinese are telling us there is an alternative economic model. Innovation, which comes with markets, can be combined with direction, which comes from the top. And you can get an innovative economy without and still have government interference, still have government direction. That's what's being tested now in China. And that test is going to have profound implications, it seems to me, for the future, how that indeed comes out. I would just wind up with another point, which seems to me fundamental in thinking about the future of American strategy and thinking about the future of Chinese strategy, and in thinking about how the Indo-Pacific countries themselves might respond to these situations. And that is this. Nobody likes to be told what to do. It seems to me that the reason that Hillary Clinton lost the election in 2016 to Donald Trump was a resistance on the part of the American people to elites on the West Coast and on the East Coast, telling the rest of the country what it had to do. It was a resistance against so-called political correctness. It was against this superior attitude looking down on other countries. And Trump exploited this situation in American politics quite brilliantly, it seems to me, and indeed did better in the recent election than the polls indicated he might. And certainly the Republicans did better in the Congress than the polls indicated that they would. So it seems to me that principle, nobody likes to be lectured to, is one that could safely transfer to international relations. I think we found that as well in our democracy promotion efforts in the post-Cold War period. And that's, it seems to me, the primary reason why so many of those have failed. So how can we find a way to respect the views of other people? How can we find a way to accept the cultural differences that exist with other people? How can we find a way that people can develop their own systems of government, their own preferences in government, and sometimes in foreign policy even, and still make that consistent with building a stable international order? I think that's a very large question confronting us, and it certainly confronts all of us who have to deal with China in this regard. To what extent do we carry concerns about human rights among the Uyghurs in Hong Kong and elsewhere? To what extent do we carry those concerns into the larger pattern of our behavior toward China, whether it's our economic policies or our security policies, or whether it's diplomacy itself? That is a huge unanswered question, it seems to me, that's out there right now. It seems to me that a second issue that is going to come up is who are the major actors in this situation now? Is it going to be the United States versus China? Should it be the United States versus China? Or should not smaller countries, and by smaller countries, I don't mean necessarily geographically, but I mean smaller countries in terms of historic influence. And here, the Indo-Pacific region comes into play. Countries not always as active in the past in world politics as they are likely to be in the future, let's put it that way. This is where those countries come in, and this is where their interests come in. And where are their interests going to align? Will they align along the idea of not being lectured to under any circumstances by anyone, and so developing their own institutions and then seeking what order can be extracted internationally from that process? Or will they come down in favor of some universal principles that all states should be accepting, even if this impairs traditional diplomatic or military relations? Those questions, it seems to me, are open right now. The other question, I think, the big one that's out there is what's going to happen to the economic integration that we thought was irreversible in the post-Cold War period, but we have found with Brexit, we have found with Trump, we have found in other situations, it is reversible. And so to what extent can a more national focus on the development of economies either contribute to or impair the stability of the international order? That one is out there too. So I have mentioned all of these not with a view to trying to offer solutions, but simply to say that these are concerns that it seems to me we should have. It does seem to me that one of the great dynamic developments of the past few years is now reversing, and this is the withdrawal of the United States from responsibility, period, in the domestic scene, in the international scene, in the moral scene as well. All of this resulting from the consequence of electing an idiot president of the United States back in 2016. He is on the way out now. And more conventional policies certainly are on the way in. So that in itself is going to be a major change in the international situation. It may be a point of reversal for some of these trends that have been going on. But I do think that it would be useful to look back on the entire period from 1991 and the end of the Cold War on, try to figure out why the record of American grand strategy in those years. And then look beyond that, to go back to the record of 1947 to 1991, to go back to the Cold War itself, to go back to the long peace and say something like, well, they didn't do that badly in that period. That grand strategy actually took an promising situation, strung it out in a way that avoided war and avoided appeasement, and in the end produced a peaceful collapse of a great power, something that was thought to be impossible in world politics. We have heard a lot, though not as much in recent years, about peaceful rises of great powers. But we never did think much about the peaceful collapse of a great power, because this had really never happened before until it did with the Soviet Union in 1989-91. So we must have done something right in that period. It seems to me we have done a lot that has been wrong in the quarter century or so since then. And it seems to me that we in this country, but others in countries around the world with whom we are friendly, and I hope that includes the Indo-Pacific region, confront new possibilities now. And that's where I'd like to stop if I could. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Professor, for a very comprehensive and interesting lecture. We learned a lot, and we have also received a huge number of questions. So without wasting much time, let me move to the questions. And the first question is, what is the fate of Indo-Pacific strategy under Biden administration? Will Biden administration push for the Indo-Pacific strategy?
I have no idea. I don't know. And I'm not sure anybody knows quite now. We do know who will be making policy in the Biden administration. We know Jake Sullivan very well as National Security Advisor because he's a colleague here at Yale. We know a good deal about Tony Blinken, who's going to be the Secretary of State. But beyond that, it's still an open question. We know something. We know a lot about Biden as well. So I would expect something that would be a return in some way to the policies of, say, the Obama administration in this regard. But I hope not in an automatic or unthinking or uncritical way, because it seems to me there are lessons to be taken on board here. There are lessons to be learned from the Obama administration's experiences in the Middle East. There are lessons to be learned from the failure of economic integration over the last few years. And certainly there are lessons to be learned as well from one other thing that I think is absolutely critical. And this is, no foreign policy can be stronger than the level of domestic support for it. And if in fact elites begin to neglect non-elites, not just in this country, but in any country, if the so-called educated people talk only to the so-called educated people and don't listen to other people, then it seems to me the underpinnings, the foundations of a strong foreign policy are undermined. And I think that was a failure of the Democratic administrations, the two Democratic administrations of Obama. I hope Biden is sensitive enough to this that this will not happen, or will happen less often in this country. But that's a consideration, it seems to me, for all of us, not just for Americans, to be thinking about. How can we bridge the gap between us, the so-called educated people, and most other people who do not have the benefit of higher education, but nonetheless are affected by our decisions, whose vote is critical, whose support is critical. And if that's lost, then a lot of other things are lost as well.
Let me move to the next question. According to you, how is China going to respond to the Indo-Pacific strategy? Can we say that the world is witnessing a clash between China's BRI and US Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, I think a clash is already happening. And we have to understand that the Chinese seem to have welcomed this. The Chinese have gone through a very dramatic change in the last 6 or 8 years. From a low profile, this was the Deng Xiaoping strategy, to something else. And you can call it wolf warrior diplomacy. You can call it a return to Chinese imperial behavior. You can call it a resurgence of Chinese nationalism. But it has been dictated from the top. That is pretty evident. These are Xi Jinping's strategies. And they deliberately seem intended in some ways to be provocative. If you listen to Xi Jinping, you get the sense that the feelings of the Chinese people are immensely delicate, because the Chinese are so often telling us, you have bruised, you have offended the Chinese people through whatever it is that we have done. Well, many of the things that have offended the Chinese people, have been very small things indeed, symbolic things even. And if that's the case, the Chinese people have extremely delicate sensibilities, which I doubt very much. The Chinese people indeed have a long historical tradition, great self-confidence, it seems to me. So that gap, that use of the bruised feelings of the Chinese people by the Chinese leaders is something that's worth watching. One principle that we might lay down here, coming from past experience on this, is that there is a difference between those regimes that are comfortable with differing points of view in international relations. And so one can have different systems, one can come from different cultures, one can speak different languages, and still have an amicable relationship. This is what diplomacy is meant to be about. There's a difference between that on the one hand, and on the other hand, the kind of country that sees or that depends on the hostility of the outside world, the kind of regime that is sufficiently insecure about its own position at home that it has to generate a hostile outside world. This is a point that Kennan made about Stalin's Russia, that nothing could reassure it, because the only justification for keeping such a repressive regime in power was that the outside world was just waiting to intervene and crush it, which of course was not true. But this meant that traditional means of diplomacy would not work with Stalin, and I think Kennan was right about that. The question is that true of Xi now? And I don't know the answer to it. I don't think anybody knows the answer to it. Perhaps President Xi himself does not know the answer to it. But it does seem to me that his actions in the last 4 or 5 years have raised that question once again. Is China today a power that is capable of being reassured? Or is it always going to be nursing its own bruised feelings? That's a big difference.
So, Professor, are we facing a new Cold War situation between China and US? Can the status quo be described as a new Cold War?
Well, there are Cold Wars and Cold Wars. So we can say that the Cold War of 1945, 1991, put that in capital letters, was a particular period in history that had certain definable characteristics. But in another sense, there have been Cold Wars throughout history, by which I mean international relationships that have been uneasy, that have been suspicious, rivalries, all of this kind of thing, that did not at the same time or at any time erupt into hot wars. So if you think about British-Russian rivalries in Asia, for example, in the 19th century, the Great Game in Asia, this went on for decades, but it never actually developed into a major war. The worst that happened was the Crimean War, and that was not over Asia in the first place. And there have been many other examples in history. The long Anglo-American rivalry, Anglo-American relations were not amicable at all through the 18th and the 19th centuries. And they only erupted in war once, and it was a farcical war, the War of 1812. And that was a kind of Cold War until the British decided it was in their interests to end it. And there are plenty of other examples that one can find of this. So these are Cold Wars, not with capital letters, but simply as the generic and normal rivalries that exist between great powers. Those, it seems to me, will certainly continue to exist. And I think that's where China is at this moment. Whether China will escalate this, or whether the Americans, as far as that goes, will escalate it, I don't think so now, not now, into something that is of the epic proportions of the 1945-1991 Cold War with capital letters remains to be seen. But I think we should avoid the temptation to say all international rivalries are a revival of the Cold War.
Let me move to the next question. How much commitment will the Suga administration will have towards free and Indo-Pacific at the cost of alienating China? Now that Biden is back and the traditional US-Japan equation has looked overthrown under Trump is no longer a threat for Japanese.
Well, I think Japan will continue to play much the role that it has in that venture. Japan is in an interesting situation. It is both an actor and it is acted upon. And that has been its posture ever since the end of World War II. It is an industrial power. It is a military power, even though it calls these self-defense forces, as we know. It could be a formidable military power, presumably, if necessary, but it's one with unique reluctances to use military power, for sure. And it's an offshore power. So its logic is to be aligned with the United States, which is itself an offshore balancing power because of the location of the United States. And we have always been more sympathetic to strategies of offshore balancing than to onshore commitments, particularly onshore commitments on the Eurasian continent. Many of these, particularly these onshore commitments in Asia, did not work out very well for us. So offshore balancing is our preference. Indeed, if you go back to something that Kennan had a hand in 1949, the so-called defensive perimeter strategy, in which he said our post-World War II strategy in the Pacific will be to defend the offshore islands of Japan, Okinawa, the Philippines, but not Taiwan, because Taiwan was part of China. But we would avoid land commitments on the Eurasian continent. Our strengths were air and naval, but not armies. And that was the logic of the strategy, which remained in existence for about 6 months until Stalin and Kim Il-sung, having read the public speech that announced this, launched the Korean War, where we abandoned that strategy altogether and fought a major war with China in Korea. This then led to a lot of other unfortunate engagements that did not work out very well for us. But the basic idea of offshore balancing, it seems to me, makes sense. And Japan clearly has played and can continue to play a major role in that. No question about that.
Professor, Nepal lies between China and India. While China sees Indo-Pacific aimed at themselves, India supports the strategy. In this context, what are the possible implications for Nepal?
I have no idea. I am as far from being an expert on Nepal as it is possible to imagine. So these are questions that you guys will have to work out for sure. And we're very interested to see what you conclude on this. But this is where we have to trust your judgment. And this is where we cannot prescribe for Nepal and should not try to, I think.
So let me move to the next question. How do you look at China's containment policy towards India in the present circumstances while applying the George Kennan's containment policy towards Soviet? Is it appropriate to use Kennan's containment in the case of China-Pakistan alignment vis-a-vis with India-US strategic, especially the latest trajectory of CPEC being called a Martian plan of 21st century?
I think containment, as Kennan conceived it, could be highly relevant in this situation. Because what Kennan said was that ultimately the Soviet Union would contain itself. And this was a somewhat unusual concept, but what he meant by this was that any country that depends for its own cohesion on portraying the outside world as hostile will in time create the reality of a hostile outside world. If you have the image of a hostile outside world, if you behave as if the world is hostile, it will become so. And that indeed is what happened to the Soviet Union by the 1980s. It had no friends anywhere along its peripheries. And it does seem to me that that's the risk that China runs with this policy of exaggerating Chinese nationalism and portraying its neighbors as hostile, as unfeeling toward the interests of the Chinese people. And India is no small power. India is a major power and will become all the more important as the 21st century goes on. It's very interesting in this regard, it seems to me, to think about the major Chinese initiative in Asia, the Belt and Road strategy, and the idea of what will happen as China develops its land corridors through Central Asia and all the way to Europe. And as China develops its naval connections, both elements, of course, of Belt and Road, and potentially even a third element, which could be the Arctic route, although that's less clear now. But what will happen in this regard? And the question that I would have is whether this would not begin to come across to people in the region, people affected by it, as a new form of imperialism. And I think in some ways it is. These are instruments of imperialism, railroads, navies, etc. And they are likely to produce some of the same backlashes that imperialism classically did. There are already signs that the Chinese are rethinking Belt and Road, particularly this fall. Word came that there's been a substantial cutback in the commitment to Belt and Road, partly because it's proven to be costlier than had been expected, partly because the countries receiving the aid have begun to see the aid as a debt trap, partly because the Chinese, in dealing with other cultures, are not particularly sensitive. Certainly the Americans can be insensitive in dealing with other cultures, but we are not alone in this. You know, the Chinese have some of those same characteristics once they get out of their own familiar environments. And they can come across as really being quite arrogant. And this can have a backlash effect as well. So all of this bears, it seems to me, on what happens with India. It also bears on something that nobody talks about very much, what's going to happen in Sino-Russian relations. How are the Russians going to respond to the Chinese building railroads along their periphery, which are supposed to connect with Europe? The Russians, after all, 120 years ago, built their own railway, known as the Trans-Siberian Railway, which was intended to make that connection. So how will they respond to these initiatives on the part of China? How would they respond if China becomes an Arctic presence, you know, and so on? So there's something called great power relationships that come into play here in the long run. And it does seem to me that it's unreasonable to expect the current amicable state of Sino-Russian relations to continue. And of course, the current state of Sino-Indian relations is not even amicable at this point for reasons that have mostly to do with Chinese provocation in the Himalayas. So the Chinese are following the old Soviet strategy of generating their own enemies, it seems to me, in a way that is interesting to watch. We've seen this before.
Let me move to Sri Lanka. Like Chinese Communist Party influence is clearly visible in many developing countries. Sri Lanka recently had CCP and government political party seminar where senior policy makers made a comment to follow Chinese model. How do you see the CCP's influence impacting democracies in the region?
Well, again, this is something that I'm no expert on, and I would just say what I've already said, which is that much will depend on how the how Chinese influence is projected through local communist parties. And of course, if we go back to the history of the Cold War as a model, there were two ways in which that was done. Some of the communist parties in Europe were puppets of the Russians and stayed as puppets of the Russians very much all the way through. But most of them began to develop heretical tendencies, beginning with Tito in Yugoslavia. But then later, the French Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party, national sentiments overcame proletarian internationalism in that regard. And it seems to me that that pattern is likely to repeat itself as well. As Xi Jinping becomes more and more dogmatic about insisting on ideological purity, which he certainly is doing at home, it seems to me the likely effect of this will be to alienate people for whom that ideology might be thought attractive abroad, if the pattern of the Cold War with capital letters is any guidepost here. I think it may be.
Another question is there any scope for militarization of Indo-Pacific through Quad? What is the place for a small Pacific island like Solomon Island or Kiribati in future of Indo-Pacific strategy in light of the rivalry between the US and China?
To be very, very careful, it seems to me, and defend one's own interests, but at the same time recognize the limitations of power. Some would say keep a low profile, which may be a good idea for some countries, for sure.
There's another question from a Chinese scholar. He's asking that the United States is backing India to counter China's influence in the Indo-Pacific region. What should China do to negotiate its effect and build its hegemony in the strategically important region?
Why does it need to build its hegemony in the first place? What are its motives in that regard? I think what the Chinese should do is ask themselves some question about their current policies and where they're aimed, because certainly people along the periphery of China are already asking that question, including India. So the Chinese need to, it seems to me, become more self-critical.
There's another question like how many lessons have the Chinese learned, in your opinion, from the Soviet experience in challenging the United States? What about American ability to resurrect and face challenger states through its grand strategy?
Well, I don't know how much the Chinese have learned, except in one respect. We do know from documents that have been now released, both in Russia and in China, that long before Xi Jinping rose to prominence, this was happening under Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese were making very, very careful studies of the failure of Soviet policy, particularly Soviet economic policy, in the 1970s and the 1980s, the so-called era of stagnation in the Soviet Union under Brezhnev. They studied that very carefully. They studied it very objectively, and we have books, including a couple by one of my former students, on what the Chinese learned from the Russian experience in that regard. And I don't doubt that the very different path that the Chinese pursued with regard to the organization of their economy, as opposed to the top-down version in the Soviet Union, was very much the product of what they had learned in that way. The question that I have now is what has happened to that Deng Xiaoping initiative? Simply the encouragement to the Chinese to get rich, but not caring, not making an issue the manner in which they propose to do this. It seems to me now that policy is being reined in. Look at what happened to Alibaba over the last month or so, a very successful company that has been obviously reined in by the central government, which seems to be asserting increasing control over the economy itself. And if that is the case, then I think it is likely to cause some problems, because to the extent that you try to plan a complex economy, to the extent that you try to control anything that's as complex as a modern economy, and smother self-initiative, smother enterprise, it seems to me you're asking for trouble. It may take a long time to develop. But I think that that is a caution that should be kept in mind. And it's one of the things that I'm curious about, because it does seem as if the Xi Jinping regime is suddenly discovering an enthusiasm for the leadership principles of Leonid Brezhnev, which is very odd indeed. I don't see why you would do that.
So we are running out of time, but still we have lots of questions. So maybe we'll have 2 or 3 more questions and end it there. Like almost all the countries who are part of Quad or are committed to Indo-Pacific are economically dependent on China. So what role will economy play in the future of Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, no one knows for sure. Geography tells you certain things. Culture tells you certain things. Distances tell you certain things. So we know from the trade patterns of 1,000 years that the Indian Ocean will be a major trading area, trading route for sure. We know that choke points, strategic choke points, Straits of Malacca, for example, straits to the Red Sea, will not be closing anytime soon. Continental drift proceeds too slowly for that to be an issue of geopolitics. We know that these countries have the potential, particularly with the computer revolution that is going on now, it has been going on for a while, to develop new centers of power. And certainly India is already a superpower in its computing technologies in this regard, a very competitive power indeed. So these trends are, it seems to me, going to develop. But nobody can predict economic crashes. We have a terrible record in doing that. Nobody can predict what new technologies may be emerging in the future. Nobody can predict what the threats to, what cybersecurity threats are going to occur. And that's a major issue that is going to come up and is going to influence superpower relations at all levels. It's not going to be just the Russians who are the leaders in that competitive enterprise. And so I think all we can do is hedge bets and try to remain competitive in this regard. But it does seem to me that heavy-handed top-down leadership does not encourage innovation in the same way that a more relaxed approach has done historically. And I don't see why that's likely to change.
Professor, you just mentioned about cybersecurity attacks. So there's another question, like with the rise of cyber threats around the world, the Indo-Pacific region has been the haven for state-sponsored cyber attacks. These attacks have been specifically targeted towards the US and other developed countries. Does this have any impact on the future of Indo-Pacific region, like those with the developed economies?
Well, these things have an impact on all of our futures, not just the Indo-Pacific region. So the quite astonishing cyber attack on the United States that was happening back in the fall without anybody realizing it is a major concern. So I don't see that the Indo-Pacific region is particularly singled out in this regard. I think this is something that confronts us all.
Let me move to the last question for today. Will Indo-Pacific bring China and Russia together? Is there a chance of military alliance between China and Russia in the future?
Well, there's always a chance, but what does that mean? So there was a military alliance between Russia and China in 1950. It did not prevent a very divisive Sino-Soviet split from developing as early as the end of that decade. So alliances exist on paper. Sometimes they exist in principle, but most fundamentally, alliances are at the mercy of national interests. And it does seem to me, for the reasons I mentioned, the national interests of Russia and China are more likely to collide with each other than to reflect cooperation for quite a while. It has to be realized that the West has not been wise. The United States has not been wise in the way that it has handled Sino-Russian relations. Some of us were predicting 20 years ago that NATO expansion right up to and including the former borders of the Soviet Union was sure to drive the Russians into alignment with the Chinese. And that's happened. That's where we are right now. But it's not an alignment of equals in any regard. China is far the more superior country in terms of its economic clout. The only thing that Russia has going for it are nuclear weapons, which are unusable, and then its cyber capabilities, which for the moment may be better than those elsewhere in the world, but that's unlikely to continue. And then both countries suffer from something we haven't talked about yet, but I think it should be mentioned. It's something Kennan raised in the Cold War as well. Whenever you have leaders who abolish term limits, whenever you have leaders who have proclaimed themselves to be so excellent that they will not leave power under any circumstances, and both Russia and China now have such leaders, this is a confession of insecurity, not a confession of security. It's a confession of nervousness. It's a confession of what's going to happen if I do leave power. It's what Mr. Trump is concerned about very deeply, but he will be leaving power. We know that. We don't know that about Putin. We don't know that about Xi. What it means is that very, very powerful nations, if their leaders are permanent, have to put up with the increasing senescence, senility of these leaders. Leaders do not get wiser as they get older. They get feeble, they get forgetful, they wind up like Brezhnev, and yet you can't get rid of them. That is a serious weakness for both Russia and China for the future.
Thank you, Professor, for the comprehensive and interesting lecture. We learned a lot. We are really thankful for your valuable time. We hope to see you in real in future. We'd also like to thank our participant for their presence and wonderful question. Professor, have a nice day, and good night to all our participants.
Thanks to you. Thanks for all. Thanks to all.